All right, folks, I'm ready to go ahead and get started if that's okay with everyone.
Great.
All right.
Sure.
Just want to say welcome to everyone. My name is Ross Watts, and I am at Whitworth University in chilly Spokane, Washington. We had a very hard frost this morning. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to say welcome to everyone on the Zoom call today with the Place-Based Justice Network. Our Zoom calls are really a means to continue our shared learning during the break times that we have between our summer institutes and our December leadership retreats. And our common purpose as a network says first and foremost that we are a learning community. We put those words right in there at the beginning because we do have a commitment to gathering together to advance our individual and our collective knowledge around our work. So that's really something that we value highly. I'm so glad to see so many of you here today on the call. I'm going to introduce a little bit about the call for those of you who are new to Zoom calls, and I'm going to give the opportunity for everyone to sort of sound off really quickly in the Zoom call. I know some of you are actually with us by phone, but we will have a chance for everyone to introduce themselves briefly just so we know your names. But today's call is really intended to give us a deep dive into one of our network's value statements. That's what we've been focusing on this fall semester. And last time we talked about intersectionality in our work with the goal of doing anti-racist, anti-oppressive work in communities. This particular month, we're going to be focusing on our third value in the value statement, which reads that we emphasize actions that are defined by community-identified goals that foster self-determination. So that's our third goal. And as members of our network, we've all agreed to uphold this value of affirming and supporting the self-determination of our partner neighborhoods. But it can be very tricky work. I think fostering community voice without directing community voice means that we all have to be very careful in navigating what we do. So I've asked a couple of our experienced members to lead us in a discussion of that today. It's my hope their experience can certainly inform our own practice. And before we get started, just a few reminders. In the network, we believe that these values that we share and that we uphold matter. They allow us to do justice and to do our collective work well. These values remain still relatively new to our group, however. They were just created this past academic year. So even folks who've been in this network for a while, it's new to us. We're all getting used to them together. So for those of you who are new to the Place-Based Justice Network, you are on an equal footing, I would say, with established folks in our learning community about what these values mean. And that's why these conversations can be so valuable. Please remember that among our values is a commitment to openness, integrity, and humility. That's value number 5. So in everything we do, we try to uphold openness, integrity, and humility. And I would remind you that applies also to our Zoom calls. I want to ask you to bring your best self to our learning experience today. Be present and open to the possibility of deepening your understanding of the work that we do. It's a great time to shut down your phone and your email. And also be aware of and honor the developmental nature of our learning. There are some folks who've been doing this work for a long time and are established. Others are just embarking on this work. But remember that we can all gain by practicing that intellectual fair-mindedness that helps us to learn from the stories of others. Remember that each of us in our contexts institutionally works in our specific communities, but this group itself is a kind of meta community. That's the way I conceptualize it. So bring that spirit of humility and mutuality to our time together. It's going to be great. So with that said, I'd like to very quickly have everyone sound off so we know who's here. My name is Ross. I'm in Spokane, Washington. I'll hand it over to everyone else.
My name is Erin. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland.
Chris Nayve, University of San Diego.
Hi everyone, this is Salam with University of Washington.
Hi, this is Jen Britton at Drexel University.
Hi, this is JP Gralfi with John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio.
This is Kara McEwen from the University of New Brunswick in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada.
Sanaye Mohammed, Drexel University.
Katie Traveling, also at Drexel University.
Samantha Kuhn, St. Mary's College of California.
Tracy Chason, St. John, New Brunswick, Canada.
Erin Burrows from Seattle University.
Ine Abbey, Seattle University.
Kent Coast, Seattle University.
Hi, this is Kristen Menson from Pacific Lutheran University.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for sharing out. Have I missed anyone? I'll give you 5 seconds.
Hi, this is Lena Dastilio from Pittsburgh.
Great, thank you, Lena. Right now, I'd like to introduce 2 folks from our network who are going to be sharing their experience in fostering community voice and self-determination. We're going to be hearing from Chris Nayve, who is Associate Vice President for Community Engagement and Anchor Initiatives at the University of San Diego, and we're so glad that he's able to join us after some last-minute tech issues. And Erin O'Keefe, the Director of the Center for Community Service and Justice and the York Road Initiative in Loyola, Maryland. I've asked Chris and Erin to address the forms of listening they use in partner neighborhoods, the unique resources that they have on their campus to help partners' voices be heard, the areas in which their partners have the greatest or perhaps the least capacity for self-determination, and then finally how they address epistemic differences between campuses and communities that can keep our partners from seeing themselves as co-creators of our work. So I'm going to hand it over to Erin first. Thanks, Erin.
Bet. Thanks, Ross. Good morning or good afternoon or good midday to all. I'm thrilled to see so many folks still even joining the meeting. So my name is Erin O'Keefe, and Chris and I are going to go back and forth here this afternoon. I just want to give a little context. You'll see the slide right in front of you says that our York Road Initiative, which is our place-based initiative here in Baltimore City, in a very in about a 2-mile stretch of North Baltimore City that is particularly egregious in its racial and socioeconomic divisions that have been planned over time here in Baltimore. It's a community that has been has felt the effects of redlining and white covenant communities, and our institution in particular moved to this neighborhood from its downtown campus in the early 20s as the white covenant communities were really taking place on 3 sides of our campus. So our focus work is on that 4th side of the campus. And I wanted to just start out by saying that we're at about the 10-year mark. And I've been at the institution since 2010. And so the first 2 years of an initiative, we really didn't have any staff overseeing it. We had a university committee. As you can imagine, that's a very different scenario. So I just wanted to start out, Erin, if you could just go to the next slide. Philosophically, when I came on board to Loyola and we decided to put staff behind the initiative, we really, you know, my personal and our team here, our philosophy is rooted in asset-based community development. And so I think this is an important reminder for all of us. I know many of us have been in many places in this work, but some basic 3 ABCD principles that are really helpful to start with is, you know, what can residents do for themselves, period, individually or as an association, without any outside help, and us as university members really starting from that principle of, do we know? Are we familiar with what are the assets on the ground that residents are engaging in before we are offering any resources? Then really trying to listen at, you know, where are we asked to be? And so in some sense, where are institutions helpful and where are they harmful to neighborhood-based organizations, and particularly in areas that are deeply segregated or in communities that have experienced disempowerment over, you know, generations, as many of our neighboring campuses and communities are. Even that understanding at the resident level is something that is particularly important to bring up. So I just wanted to share this slide first. This is sort of our general philosophy. I think that Erin, if you could go to the next slide, when we started our York Road Initiative in sort of just as right prior actually to before I came on and they hired any staff, the institutional committee was very thoughtful in you know, really having a listening project. And so before any action happened in the neighborhood, and I guess this is the benefit of having institutional committees. They're very slow if you don't have staff to them, or they don't really have a strategy early on. And so luckily for us, the first thing that we did was a pretty robust listening project. And this was a co-created survey in 2009 with residents, resident leaders, where Loyola faculty, staff, and administrators paired up and did one-on-one listening. And this is a model that came out of the Southern Poverty Law Center and a lot of the civil rights reconciliation projects in the 1960s. And so from the beginning, we found we had a number of different one-on-one meetings. We then focused our initiative out of this listening project to be able to have some focus areas. So this was just the early iteration. Surveying, right? Or in particular, in our case, one-on-one listening with residents and diverse groups was the foundation of the initiative, which I think was helpful. And as I said, this was just prior to the institution hiring me. So I'll get a little bit more into that, but that's the context that I'm coming from today. And Chris, I just wanted to pass it to you, or never mind. I guess I have all the slides first. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit more about where we are today. So after, you know, an initiative that had slowly grown over time, we focused on building neighborhood civic capacity so that residents really had some infrastructure to be able to voice their concerns and focusing a few small projects like a farmer's market that was a direct result of our initial listening survey, and having partnerships with schools and a whole variety of things. I think where we are now is this slide here, which I really love, and it's an important you know, progression of how institutions work with partners, but more so where we are institutionally moving to beyond the collaborating phase and into the empowering phase, I hope. I think at the beginning of our initiative, we were listening really strongly, and now where we are is trying to figure out how we can step back in some ways and really give community members the sole decision-making power around how the institution engages in a long-term strategy. This is a slide that I would, you know, you'll all, Erin will share this out after the follow-up of our call, but I recently showed this slide to a number of our institutional university cabinet members, and I have to say this was kind of surprising to folks to even think in this way. You know, what does collaboration really mean, and how can we, you know, only serve in supportive roles as an initiative? And this is helpful for me to sort of check in on a regular basis. So the next slide is just a little bit about where we are now. After, as I said, we're at about the 10-year mark of our work, and we've incubated projects. We really spent the first 4 years just building relationships with resident leaders and organizations. So informally, in addition to sort of our listening projects early on, we have resident leaders on on the farmers market committee that we oversee, and in a couple of different sort of advisory roles. We certainly also have a team meeting every week where resident leaders and university folks are together sort of checking in on the day-to-day projects. But as we're thinking through to the next 10 years of our initiative, we realized we really needed to focus and change culture a little bit. We had incubated a lot of projects, and those were great, but how do we create impact over time? And so we started last fall with a culture-based workshop, really focused on collective impact and how we can work more effectively together. And so out of that, we then co-created another survey. So, you know, the more formal method for sure, but we had all of our nonprofit partners, and those would be sort of your Habitat for Humanities, your Rebuilding Together organization, the folks that are in our neighborhood in particular, the sort of more of the community organizing organization that we work with really closely, as well as the resident-led coalitions and neighborhood associations, weigh in on a pretty robust survey to understand where we are at this point in time and what are the most urgent and important issues facing citizens and residents. And so 675 residents responded to this survey last February and March. What we did from there is, Erin, if you can go to the next slide, we pulled together folks to look at the data. We did 2 days of meetings in May where we had residents from both the east side of York Road and the west side of York Road, which is the dividing line in terms of race and class, pair up, as well as pair up with folks from Loyola and other nonprofits, so the professional folks with resident folks in some sense. Look at the data, look at what we heard. No one had seen it in advance, so it was an opportunity for folks to build relationship and ask questions together. And then from there, look at sort of what was heard, and these were you know, surveys from residents compared to the census level data trends that we knew. So for example, if we heard things around public safety, then we also presented the American Community Survey data around what were the actual numbers in our community. Out of that, we heard very loud and clear that folks wanted a real deeper dive on the qualitative data that came out, as well as some particular focus groups with young people in our community, as well as a more particular focus on African-American young people in our community. As like any survey, you're always going to have, for a survey for us in particular, you know, you have more respondents that are older adults. And we found, because we were doing both door-to-door surveys as well as surveys in the neighborhoods, but the online survey really took off. We had it in Qualtrics. And so we had a higher population of folks that were from the west side of York Road who were predominantly white that responded. And so we really needed to equalize that out. And so then over the summer, we did focus groups again. So that is, you know, a real quick summary of where we are now. I think, you know, there are multiple forms of listening that we're in right now. And I have to say that we're able to do this work through a grant. And so that's another important resource. Not only is this process informing our next steps for our York Road initiative, but this is data that is now owned by community residents so that they are able to not only apply for grants, but also, you know, have a greater understanding of what folks, you know, even outside the folks that show up for the neighborhood association meeting are desiring in the community. And so I think they're really critical resources that we have to offer there. I also think that we have a sociologist here at Loyola that's working with us on the qualitative results right now. And 2 weeks ago, or gosh, 3 weeks ago now, we did a really deep dive with him over 2 days with about 50 different community residents. And I have to say, it's really empowering for folks on the ground who live in neighborhoods to see their own opinions be validated by data, and to have a faculty member who can challenge people who live on different sides of the street to say, you know, here's how you perceived this, and here's how you perceive this. And folks, you know, if we're really not neighboring across York Road, we're not going to be able to work together. So I'll sort of pause there. I think I have 2 more slides. Never mind. I really feel like I'm talking too much. Go back one more, Erin.
Just one.
I'll finish. Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay.
So just for sake for you all, this is the timeline of where we are right now. So as I said, we really started out with an university task force. You know, we started with listening. We slowly grew over time. We moved into more of a partnership model where we were providing backbone support for a variety of different resident-led initiatives. And then we grew. We integrated into our Center for Community Service and Justice, and that sort of provided the structure internally. And we were implementing a lot of things, in particular some of our corner store initiative and some programs at the local elementary schools. And now we're really in the reassessment phase, really re-listening, ensuring that we are not working in our own silo for sure, but really at the point of how are we empowering community voice so that it's not just beneficial for our work, but beneficial for our entire community's work. And then finally, you know, making sure that we are creating impact and that this is not just, small little one-off projects, but that there's a real integration over time to move a population level result. And the final slide I'll leave you with is just something that, a quote really that I appreciated. I recently reread this, and I think it's, again, part of the philosophy piece. And I'll read it out loud for those of you who are on the phone, but relationships are the primary currency of community work, not data or money. The preferred process is one that values what goes on between people, not goes on within them as disaggregated individuals. It's not about counting numbers of people who show up, but about cheering on the participation and contributions that deepen community life. Focus must remain on learning and sharing, not auditing and counting. And I say that as sort of a final part right here, just to say that, yes, I just talked a lot about data and surveys, and those are deeply important. And that goes back to one of Ross's questions around, that is a critical role for us as institutions. But if we're not, as academic institutions, but if we're not also focusing on relationships and people, then we're doing a disservice to any of our place-based work. I'll take a breath now.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. And it's great to be on the call with you all. Erin, it was great to see your slides and you sharing your processes. I'll share some of the framing here at USD, but a lot of my reflections will be fairly contemplative in terms of my own practice and how that influences the work that I do here. And apologies that my desktop does not have a camera, but I'm actually working on getting a working laptop here shortly. So hopefully, fingers crossed. And I can hear my colleague John Loggins in the background yelling to me that the 1990s are on the phone calling me and they would like their old technology back. So nothing but love in our office. And it's really great to be part of this growing place-based justice network, and just want to acknowledge all of the great leadership from the Seattle U team, Kent, Rachel, who's no longer there, Erin, Erica, Ine, Charles from Annie E. Casey, I'm not sure if he's on the phone, and then of course the core leadership team of the Place-Based Justice Network for being such a committed group of scholars and practitioners who are really holding us accountable, and really appreciative to co-facilitate with the indomitable Erin and Ross, who are awesome. Also, my window to my office is also broken, and that's our landscaping team out here at the university. So hopefully that's not too loud, and I'll try my best to accommodate. But I have all these broken technologies here. I guess that's what happens when you're in an old Catholic school building here. But so before I share my reflections, I did want to frame USD in relation to our place-based focus. And so, like many of you, USD has multiple orientations and approaches to the work here. You can see we do have a place-based focus. We've been in our particular neighborhood for, for almost 70 years, but a particular place-based focus the past 30. We have a community engagement approach and pedagogy. We're also part of the Ashoka Changemaker Network, so social innovation is part of our approach and orientation. And then we also have an anchor mission. Next slide, please, Erin. So this is reflected in our current strategic plan called Envision 2024. President James Harris, many of you may know him during his time when he was president at Widener Universities, and he was at Widener University, and he was one of the early anchor presidents. And so when he came, he realized we had this anchor commitment to our local neighborhood, and he wanted to ensure that that was one of the key pillars to our strategy moving forward. You can go to the next slide, Erin. And so, you know, the university is situated in the Linda Vista neighborhood, and thanks to Eric and Kent, this actual slide was created by the Seattle U team, and it's in their place-based book that just came out. And while I'm sharing some of the partnerships here in Linda Vista where the university is located, in fact, the colorful part is where the university is in relation to our partnership corridor. We're also taking our anchor mission, and we're in several other neighborhoods. We're also in the community of City Heights, Logan Heights. We're across the border in Tijuana. And then we also have a tribal liaison who is helping us to articulate our land acknowledgements since the University of San Diego sits on Kumeyaay land. And Erin, you can go to the next slide. Okay, hopefully that's better and you could hear me a little better. So that's our current land acknowledgement that acknowledges the land on which we gather as the traditional unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. And this acknowledgement wants to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to ancestral lands. So that's really important for us as we articulate, well, what is the neighborhood, right? There's this ongoing question with folks who have a place-based and anchor mission about, how far out is the university's touch on these core concepts. And while that's still being worked out, we also feel that if we're going to be doing this work, we have to acknowledge the ancestral land we're on. So that is the backdrop at USD. And the other prompts that we were asked to consider for today was, what forms of listening do we practice in our partner neighborhoods? How do we minimize the epistemic differences between campuses and communities so that our partners see themselves as co-creators of our work? And that, what is my personal philosophy and practice on listening? And to me, these are really critical contemplative questions because it's not just about scholarship or best practices or models. But for me, it's this way of being and meaning making. And I think my practice of listening is really rooted in this next slide, Erin, please, with Audrey Lord. This idea of without community, there is no liberation, but community must not be the shedding of our differences or pretending they do not exist. And this really, to me, is visualized by the next slide. A colleague of mine, his name is Kevin Barrera, who continuously asks this question, what does your cornfield look like? And, when he does this exercise, it encourages to consider, well, what's our frame? What's our lens? And then in the next slide, he puts this up. And, it's a reminder that my practice must include continuous perspective taking in a way that is about curiosity and humility, as Ross talked about, to know that our cornfields are really, really different. So I would say, again, this is, I'm trying to kind of share as much as possible within the contemplative approach. I would say another important part of my practice was made clear by Yarrow Derwin in the next slide, and her work with polarities. And she was introduced to us by the Seattle U team during our last place-based justice meeting in Seattle. I can't remember if it was a year ago or maybe a little longer. And this really resonated with me because I think so much of our language in academia is about problem and solution, which kind of sets us on this fix-it/we know better path. And as many of you know in our field, sometimes that is described as this savior mentality. So I just wanted to share this particular slide in the work of Yarrow Derwin because I think I've used this quite a bit. And some of you who are on this call who've been my sounding board, it's this, this continuum of here's our mission, sometimes being in conflict with our practice, right? And so we're not congruent in that. So this is something that's helpful for me. And in the next slide, here's some more, I thought this was really important. Yarrow talks a lot about, and again, I'm not going to do the way she framed this much justice, but I did want to point this out. How is polarity different from a problem? And while I won't read all these out, I think this was really important because it moves us from this, we have the answer, we fix it mentality to, well, what is ongoing and what is just part of our framework. So I just wanted to give that some space. Next slide, please. And so then a friend of mine, Jordan Flaherty from New Orleans, he reminds me that every day it is about decentering our privilege, right? And that it's important for my philosophy and practice to kind of constantly be thinking about his particular quote. The best way to combat the savior mentality is to act collectively for systemic change in a way that is accountable to the communities affected. So that's my personal philosophy towards listening. And I think, Erin, I keep going to share how my personal philosophy influences my professional work. Let's see here. Oh, we can keep going on that one, Erin. Right, these are just other elements of my personal practice that is listed in the place-based justice goals, like when you scroll down to really think about what are the practices of our network, this concept of deliberative dialogue being really key and central to that. I think it really brings in this idea of storytelling, community storytelling, this notion of noticing and mindful attending that Ellen Langer really talks about, and this idea of listening to understand. All right, so we will move forward. And then just a few more comments and a couple of slides, and then I'll pass it over to Erin. I think I just want to acknowledge the great work that many of you on this call also have done in this area of bridging town and gown and creating mutually beneficial relationships. You know, I think of Charles Rutheiser's Forward in the Road Half Traveled book by Rita Hodges and Stephen Dubb. You know, when Charles was asking residents for a focus group, what does he think of an anchor institution approached by universities? It was striking when one of the residents had said, well, you know, this resident took some time and said, yeah, that sounds about right. The university taking a big, heavy object and donking us on the head. You know, I'm glad Lena's on the call, Lena Distilio from University of Pittsburgh, and prior to that, Duquesne, in her publication on the community engaged professionals, in particular, the chapter on models of community partnerships. And then she led a really good workshop with Emily Yonke from UNC Greensboro on partnership expectations, which I think is very important. The folks of Imagining America recently at their conference talking about partnerships as a liberatory pedagogy. Also thinking about the term reciprocity that we use in our field, and Eric Hartman and Nora Reynolds from Haverford College, who helped lead the global service learning movement, talk about the blueprint and strategic path to reciprocity so it doesn't stay as a hope. Or the way Rachel Stewart, formerly of Seattle U, once expressed, you know, reciprocity is more than a hug. So, you know, again, I just wanted to share that so much of my approach in learning is rooted in what I've learned from friends and colleagues. And so how do I bridge that? So I've shared that deliberative dialogue slide. And then this particular slide by Rigo Reyes, who is a community partner in Logan Heights. I thought this was really important reflections that he shared with us. And he's been doing this work. He's one of the founders of the lowrider movement here in San Diego. He brings a lot of students to his particular community. And these were his reflections. In fact, these reflections were captured in a joint article that he had done in partnership with St. Mary's. I think St. Mary's folks are on the call with their Engaging Pedagogies in Catholic Higher Education journal. So a plug for that if you want to see his full article. And I thought these reflections were my reflections, right? That campus and community share these reflections as part of our work, and by bringing them to the surface, it allows us to do better in how our approaches are showing up. Next slide, please. And then, you know, I'll share that, you know, a lot of what I shared about how my professional practice is informed. You know, I really learned so much of that from friends like Rigo, as well as friends in San Diego, community wisdom holders throughout Tijuana, New Orleans, and Jamaica. And I think ultimately how my listening practice and philosophy influences my work is creating these counter narratives to epistemic injustice by uplifting epistemic justice practices. So, or as another way of framing that is, how are we ensuring that we're not exploiting community knowledge, right? And so there's some work that John from our team and Star Moore from USF and John Saltmarsh are doing, and this idea of, you know, who is really involved in expanding the concept of who has knowledge and how can community knowledge be recognized in a way that is not exploitative or token, but truly centralized. So I'll just close with a reminder from one of our friends in New Orleans. Her name is Mama J, and she says, you know, culture is not an event, it is a process. So I'll hand it back to Erin.
All right, I'm unmuting myself to come back. Thank you, Chris. And I'll just jump in here to say, you know, I think the beauty of working, at least for me with Chris, is that we both communicate in very different ways. And I hope that this call is helpful for you all from, you know, the spirit of our work, but also some of the practicalities. And so at this point, we really wanted to open it up to questions. I think we really value having a robust dialogue here, and I'm going to look to Ross in some sense to help mediate a dialogue or at least help reach folks who have questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I'd love to open it up to questions. I kind of want to, we've heard two very different approaches to listening presented here. And we had as Chris mentioned, a strategic roadmap or a plan that we heard about in Baltimore with Loyola, Maryland. And then we heard very much about the personal goals of Chris at University of San Diego in listening well. And I'd like to open up the question to folks on the phone to share your own personal strategies for listening well and effectively in communities so that we can learn from one another. And I'm willing to start. One of the, I came to my work in community engagement from the faculty side and realized within the first 18 months or so that it was incredibly important for me not to be perceived as faculty at all of the various listening groups and partner meetings that I attended, but instead to be seen as, I think, a co-participant in the work of a lot of our schools, organizations, and neighborhood groups. And so it dawned on me at a certain point that my research, for lack of a better term, but essentially my academic work was going to be attending things like marches that I was invited to, or community events and children's book readings and STEM nights and all of these sorts of things. And it took a kind of reframing from my own perspective, not only to see that as part of my work, but also to be very attentive to how I presented in those spaces. As a credentialed academic from an institution, I was assumed to have a lot of knowledge when I walked in the room, and I began very deliberately no longer referencing myself as either a faculty member or even as an administrator, and I stopped using my academic title for very deliberately and very consciously, and then also tried to be attentive to other signs, symbols, and gestures that I shared in those spaces that conveyed a sense of distance or difference between myself as a knower and my community partners as a knower. So those were just some of the things that I did, and I would love to open it up to other folks who might have a story, an anecdote, or an experience or a strategy that they've used in listening and building trust in communities.
This is Kent from Seattle U, and I have one reflection on my own practice, but then I have a question that arises, Chris and Erin, from your presentation. And I find, for me, the value of connecting with people on an interpersonal level, and I think it's of central to me, is having a family and having a sort of distinguishing professional and personal life for me that I find that it blends. And so I'm always, when I'm engaging people on campus or in the community, I think I'm often just curious about, like, how are you? And how's your family in terms of how you would define that? And I find that that question often leads to a deeper exploration on a human level. But my question, Chris and Erin, is what you've shared in terms of some of the strategies of listening. And Erin, your quote about the quote that you utilized around relationships being the primary currency. And Chris, your naming of storytelling and noticing and mindful attending. When I think of one of the, perhaps it's a polarity of our work, the need for us to show results and show impact, whether that's it's kind of an accountability factor for our community partners, our campus partners, or funders, or even just the culture of measurement. How do you hold those spaces of needing to show impact and have accountability, but also in some ways the harder things to measure, perhaps, relationships, being mindful, being present. How do you hold that?
You want to start, Chris?
You go for it, Erin.
Yeah, Ken, I think that's a really beautiful question, and I think we all struggle with that, right? For me, it starts with culture, and I think that culture, this is one of my other favorite phrases, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so if we don't create a culture both as leaders of our initiatives and in our community around creating space and time and intentionality around the practices that build relationships and build community, then we can't get to impact. And so, you know, especially in the type of work that we all do where we have multiple different people and the silos that they come from, whether it's on campus or in the community. And by in the community, in this sense, I mean, you know, our folks at City Hall or our folks that that run nonprofit organizations, and certainly resident leaders who come from different neighborhoods and might have, you know, their own little silos there too. And so I think if we don't start with practices that build relationships, whether it is, Kent, something as simple as, you know, tell me about your family, or having regular potlucks, or having, you know, time at the beginning of every strategy or work meeting to create space. And as, you know, as Chris so beautifully modeled for us, you know, having a mindfulness practice and incorporated in there as well. And, you know, I wish I'd said I know a silver bullet, but I'll be honest, when we, so for the first, you know, I guess about 6 years of our initiative, it was really, it was very small. It was community-based only. It was originally only me, and then we built up staff over time, just a couple folks, some AmeriCorps members, and our fantastic assistant director for our York Road initiative. And we were in the neighborhood, and we were accessible. Our office was in the neighborhood. And for me personally, if anytime anyone walked through our door, you know, it was about them, their family, what was going on that day on the block, on the corner, whatever it was. And I had really strong relationships with people. When we, and I would say, and the practice at meetings was much more familiar based before anything to do got done. When we integrated our initiative into our Center for Community Service and Justice, which is more on campus, I personally didn't have the time to spend building as many relationships and being as present in the neighborhood, because the, you know, number of staff changed and responsibilities changed, and my presence on campus was much more, it needed to be much more deeply tended to. And so I think I go back and forth personally around building relationships on campus and building relationships in the community and being able to strengthen those at different times. And so, yeah, it is a clear polarity, but I do believe that in creating impact, our resident leaders want impact more than anything else, right? I mean, we need jobs in our neighborhood. We need kids that are not, you know, that have access to an education. We need folks that, you know, are not in jail by the time they're 16. And so, you know, I think folks are, you know, we have an urgency around impact too on the community level. It's not just that we need to count and move population level results internally, it's externally. But at the end of the day, for me, is if you do not have those strong relationships, then people will not work well together. And if we can't work well together, then we can't collaborate together. And if we can't collaborate together, then we can't move toward impact.
So, Erin, Chris, I'm sorry, did you want to respond?
I'm sorry? There was a little
Chris,
static.
were you looking to respond? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, I could just, a quick response to you, Kent. I think Seattle does a great job of communicating and disseminating your impact. And as all of you know, there's this constellation of communication and dissemination, right? There's websites, the brochures, the annual reports, the campus community forums. And I think those are all really important. And if we just stayed here, what I've noticed at our university is when we just stay in that traditional space of communicating and sharing what's happening in the neighborhood and what our impact is, the campus structures, the campus inertia structures can dismantle that in the same typical ways academia can often dismantle other structures. So what I found to be helpful as a bridge is, you know, a participatory action and impact type model, right? That is felt. I mean, it's really rooted to what Erin was saying about relationship building. What I've been doing recently is, especially with all the senior leader transitions that happens on a lot of our campuses, right? So like sometimes it feels like we just get all this great information out. You have to be in constant communication with it because knowing not everyone's going to look at the website, not everyone's going to resonate with the report, not everyone is going to feel comfortable in a large campus forum to kind of express how they really feel. You're constantly going back and forth of what is effective in using them all. We have been using an immersion model to share out what our campus leaders and our neighborhoods are feeling and thinking. And you know, that's just a felt experience, right? Because earlier I said, you know, here's all this information, and you know, you probably experienced this. I'm projecting here, but I'll go into a meeting or a department meeting or a campus forum, and folks are ready to be skeptical. Even though my mantra the past couple of years is, I don't want to convince, I just want to convey, right? So I tend to approach dissemination, conveying stories, and not necessarily, you know, trying to convince. But we have a typical structure. But when I take, you know, I just took our new provost out to meet with community leaders last night, it's just a felt experience, right? The texture is different. And the way the community can share out how the university can be accountable to the neighborhood in relationship with all our communication, with all our impact reports, I think really rounds out commitments that normally wouldn't come from folks in a typical setting. So it's interesting. One last quick thing on that is we're amongst family here, right? So, you know, hopefully even though we're being recorded, you know, we have a new provost, and she hasn't been public about her community engagement agenda. And so I was a little bit nervous going into this meeting yesterday with all these community leaders. Boy, she left that meeting like, we had like 2 pages of commitments she made to the community. And there's no way if I just share, and I did, I shared with her our normal reports, our assessment reports, surveys, all of those things. But it was just having her one-on-one, be with community leaders was the difference.
Hello, everybody. This is Anthony Medina. Oh.
Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to jump in for a sec. I had a question. I want to push a little bit more about the assessments. There's a constant tension. I'm new to the space in higher ed, but not new to community engagement. And while Ross had a different experience in terms of community listening, when a lot of the times in community engagement, my race matches the community with whom I hope to serve. And so I actually do hold my title close in terms of identifying myself, because I find that community members want to understand that I'm in a position of authority to make change happen. I had the exact opposite experience. But I will say that I want to push a little bit more about, you know, what you have had in your experience with respect to immediate needs the community might want. And then Erin, you had mentioned that you got, or on your slide, that there was some TD Rowe Price funding that you were able to secure to support York Road in the future. So when you think about, you know, community immediate needs, our need to assess what we're doing when, you know, community development work is very much about relationships that can't be measured. How are you guys, you know, dealing with that? That is a constant tension in the field. And I want to push a little more in terms of the answer, because I know this is a problem for me, I imagine for others, given, you know, Kent's question. So I want to push this a little more to address it, if that's okay.
And can we also open it up to the folks on the Zoom call, that if anyone feels compelled to answer, please jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, too. I do think that we as institutions, especially if we accept grant dollars that require reporting and impact assessment, we really need to push back on the foundations and other grant communities around what are we actually assessing? And is it our ability to create neighboring opportunities between people? Or is it about counting widgets? And we have power in that space that we can utilize. And so, you know, I'll just say anecdotally, the funding that we have right now from T. Rowe Price, it is about listening. And we've made that very clear. We're not creating, you know, we don't have to, you know, move 100 people out of poverty at the end of the year. That's not going to happen. But when, you know, we all know, I mean, every little bit of funding that you have, you're counting and measuring. And I think for me, it's how do we tell that story to a funder to say, yes, we're doing this. And the most important part is that we're actually creating spaces and places for residents to be empowered and not putting the burden of assessment on them. And yeah, I'll sort of stop there because I could go off on a tangent on how universities have power to sort of push back the foundation impact world. But yeah, I think other folks on the call will definitely have a lot of things to say here too.
Can I put someone on the spot? Is Lena still on the call?
Hi, everybody. I'm still on the call. Yeah.
You want to take a crack at that?
You know, so let me just, I really appreciate that invitation, Chris. That was fantastic. Let me also say, this is my first place-based justice network, professional development, supportive, collective, exciting learning experience today with you all. And I think we're at the beginning of our journey at the University of Pittsburgh. And so I want to be particularly responsive to Ross's invitation to come with a sense of openness and being a learner and thinking about humility here. And I'll say two things and then sort of stop. And that is, we're thinking a great deal about the ways that we can more centrally concern our university with thinking about community capacity and enabling communities to comment with evidence and evaluate our intentions and our actions. This is really messy work for us. It's messy for everybody involved. And so we're not there yet, but just know that somebody in the network, I think many of us in the network are thinking about this, but that I'm really thinking about this in concentrated doses. And so I need some time, but maybe in a near future, I can come back and circle back and offer something that's much more thoughtful.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? It's Aine.
I can hear you, Aine. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. I will be fully transparent. I feel awkward speaking on a recorded line. Just because, as Lena has also said, we're all learning and growing together. And because this is public information, it also means I don't know how this is going to be used. So when we're stretching our boundaries publicly, right now it feels like safe space because I'm like, yes, other people who are in the fight with me, who understand, who are really about this. At the same time, when you push boundaries, there's also going to be pushback. So I find my hesitancy, and I just wanted to name that for everybody, that it is hard to speak on a recorded line about something that is a huge challenge for all of us.
Aine, that is a really amazing segue to our in-person retreat coming up in December, and also to our upcoming Summer Institute this coming June 2019. So if it's okay with you, Ross, maybe we can start to wrap up and talk about next steps and other opportunities.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Aine, for helping us to make that transition. I do want to remind you folks, this is our last Zoom call for the spring. And it's been great to talk with all of you. I wish we had more time. I know there were some other questions out there. We will take a break for December and January, and that is purely from a selfish position of being on a semester system, and I was working with the subcommittee, and I said, let's take December and January off. That may not work for those of you on quarters, but we will not be gathering in those months. But we will have our next Zoom call on Valentine's Day to show our love for one another. So February 14th, 2019, we will be gathering again as a group via Zoom call. So the continuous learning subgroup is going to be planning content for that Zoom call next spring. We will be getting your feedback at the leadership retreat, which will be occurring December 12th through the 14th at St. Mary's University in Moraga, California. I'm sorry, St. Mary's College. We will have the wonderful Jennifer Pigsa and all of her great staff at the Catholic Institute for Lasallian Social Action as our hosts. And we have a great lineup of learning opportunities, experientially based, reflective, facilitated discussions, and common readings that we're going to be sharing out with you very shortly. So please look in your email inboxes for that schedule as it arrives. We're going to have even sometimes in our meals to meet with some donors, we hope, for some of this work. We've even included a wonderful evening out at Rockwall Winery, so I was very excited about that opportunity to be in Northern California and get to a winery. Hopefully you will be too. It is a no-host event and a great chance for us all, I think, to get to know one another and deepen our relationships and partnerships even within this, this network. So look for that registration in your inbox and for details on that schedule. We will be in touch with you about our next Zoom call on the 14th of December. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and you can get in touch with me or with Erin Burrows with any questions regarding Zoom calls.